صليت على إبراهيم وعلى آل إبراهيم إنك حميد مجيد اللهم بارك على محمد وعلى آل محمد كما باركت على إبراهيم وعلى آل إبراهيم إنك حميد مجيد أما بعد قال الله تعالى في القرآن المجيد يا أيها الذين آمنوا اتقوا الله وقولوا قولا سديدا وقال النبي صلى الله عليه وسلم يسروا ولا تعسروا. Again, once again, my brothers, Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. It's very nice to see an almost packed masjid, mashallah. You don't really usually see this on a Saturday. So I commend all of you, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala reward all of you for this, inshallah. I would like to speak today about a couple of things, inshallah. One of the things is the state of the ummah today. You know, there was a time where in history, in human history, where the Muslims were at the height of human civilization. All peoples in all regions, they looked to the Muslims. The same way we look to America or the West in general. You know, usually the white-dominated countries, England, Australia, and these kind of places. We look to these places for hope, for riches, for an easy life, for education for ourselves and especially, you know, a lot of our children. That's why many of us, you know, the elders here, they brought their children to this country. They came to this country for these reasons. 4 reasons of hope. Is the mic okay, brother?
If you hold it, maybe.
You want me to hold it? Okay, inshallah, yeah. So, we came to this country 4 reasons of hope, for riches, for an easy life. There was a time in history where the Muslim world was like this. Should I wait for this one? Assalamu alaikum. Is this better? Jazakallah khair. I think we'll bring it here, inshallah. Okay. So, as I was saying, the Muslim world was like America and the West in general we see today. Yeah. People would go to the Muslim world for these things that I've mentioned, yeah, for education, for hope, for an easy life. During the Islamic Golden Age, there was a time in history during the years between like 700 and 1200. This was known as the Islamic Golden Age. This was when the Muslims were at the top of human civilization. We were, you know, we dominated philosophical thought. We led the way in scientific thought and experiment. We contributed the most to technological innovations. There's one a Muslim inventor. His name was Imam Al-Jazari, or Al-Jazari, Ibn Ismail Al-Jazari. He was known as the father of robotics. You know, the car we have today is based on, you know, it works with pistons and all of these things. He built, you know, an early version of what was to come to be the car engine, which is used for cars and trains and whatnot. In fact, he was able to create a device where you could lift up water. You could lift up water without the use of any animals or anything, simply by the water current. It would come and I don't really understand it, but it would somehow push the thing and water would be raised. Massive amounts of water. Imagine this whole masjid was full of water. He was able to raise water like this. He invented something called the elephant clock. Yeah, if you have time, go on YouTube, type in the elephant clock. It's like this clock that's it works off of water. So nowadays we have electricity. The clocks are run on electricity and batteries and these kind of things. He invented a device, and many devices actually, where water was used to, you know, move certain parts of different devices and whatnot. He authored a book where he mentions 100 devices. Yeah, he writes down 100 devices that, mechanical devices, robotic devices and whatnot. But the point is, the Muslims were, very advanced for their time. The Muslims were at the height of human civilization. We were at the top financially, militarily, academically, in the sciences and the arts. All people, they looked up to the Muslims. They looked up to the Muslims and they wanted to copy and mimic the Muslims. They copied our art, our fashion, our food, our thought. Yeah, we were the trendsetters at the time. Another example of this is, this was in like the year 700. So Islam came about only 200 years ago. Yeah, around the year 700. Nabi Sallallahu he came out with his message around the year 600. So 150 years ago, after Nabi Sallallahu around the year 700. The influence of Islam even reached a little island, a little small island at the edge of human civilization at the time. At the time, America and South America, it wasn't, people didn't know about it yet. So at the edge of human civilization, there's a little island. And there was a king in this island. He was so impressed by Islamic art. What was Islamic art? Islamic art, as Muslims, we're not allowed to draw pictures of creatures and stuff, isn't it? We're not allowed to draw portraits. So Muslim artists, instead they mastered a form of art that is known as Arabic calligraphy, which is basically you write Arabic in a beautiful way. So even non-Muslims, they were so impressed by this art, how we're able to write in this beautiful way. And even like these kind of patterns. This pattern actually that you see here. These kind of pattern making and drawing this kind of way was actually mastered by the Muslims. It's called geometrical patterns. So there was a king that lived in this island. His name was King Offa. In fact, he was a king of this country here. Yeah? King Offa of England in the years around the year 700. He was so impressed by Islamic art, Islamic calligraphy, that he ordered his people to mint coins with Arabic calligraphy on them. But because his people, for whatever reason, they were not able to write Arabic, he just drew some random patterns that looked like Arabic. And in fact, again, you can Google this. If you Google Offa's coin, if you Google Offa's coin, you'll find this coin has got what looks like Arabic, but it's not really Arabic. But the point is that the Muslim influence, this is how far he reached. He even reached England at the time. That the king of England, he decided to mint coins with Arabic calligraphy on it. So my brothers, this is where we were at one point. We were, as they say, the top dogs. Nobody wanted to mess with the Muslims militarily. In terms of education, people would send their children, people would travel to the Muslim lands, Muslim Spain, Baghdad at the time. These were places where universities were. Just the way today people come to, send their children to Oxford and Cambridge and, in America, whatever colleges and universities are there. So the Muslim world was like this at one point. So the obvious question is, look at where we were and look at where we are now. The obvious question is, where did we go wrong? What led to our downfall? In fact, Nabi Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam in a hadith, he gives us the answer to this. Where the Muslims went wrong. Or what led to the downfall of the Muslims. Nabi Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam in a hadith, he prophesies the state of affairs that the Muslims are going to be in today. He mentions that there's going to come a time where the enemies of the Muslims, they're going to surround the Muslims. And they're going to attack the Muslims from every side. Just the way a person, when you have a big a tal, a big plate of food, what happens? People gather around you and they devour the food. Everyone's taking their pick. In this way, the Muslims are going to be attacked by the non-Muslims. A Sahabi asked Nabi Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam that, why will this be the case? Is it because the Muslims are going to be less in number? Is it because the Muslims are going to be few? Prophet Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam answered that no. The Muslims are going to be large in number. In fact, today, a recent study, 2023, they found that the Muslims have reached 2 billion. So for a long time, the statistics was 1.8 billion Muslims. Now they found out that Muslims have exceeded 2 billion in the world. That's more than a quarter of the human population. So going back to the hadith, the Sahabi asked, is it because the Muslims are going to be few on that day? Nabi Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam said, no, the Muslims are going to be many. And he basically explained that they'll be struck by al-wahan. They'll be struck by al-wahan. The Sahabi asked, what is al-wahan? What is this quality that's going to inflict the Muslims and lead to their downfall? The Prophet ﷺ explained that al-wahan is love of the dunya and hatred for death. The Prophet ﷺ said, essentially, that love of the dunya and hatred for death will lead to the downfall of the Muslims. It will be the reason why the Muslims will go from a state of being the superior, going from a state where they are at the top, to where we are now, where Western countries, especially America and Britain, up until like 1950s, well, they dominated our countries. Colonization, everyone knows about this word, and now there's like a secret form of colonization. There's a democracy in the world, but it's not really. And it's dominated by America and American interests. But Prophet ﷺ mentions that love of the dunya and hatred for death will be the cause of our downfall, will be the reason why the Muslims will be weak during this time. Another question we can ask is, how do we now restore the honor Muslims once had? How do we now restore the glory of Islam? How do we now restore a state or the status of Islam in the world's mind? To answer this, we need to understand how is it that love of the dunya and hatred for death led to our downfall. You see, when love of the dunya, this love of the world, when it enters a person's heart, it opens the door to worldly distractions. When love of the dunya enters a person's heart, it opens the door to worldly distractions. A person begins to think that life is meant for pleasure. A person begins to think that life is meant for comfort. He thinks that he ought to enjoy the many pleasures and distractions of life, that he ought to indulge himself in food, in entertainment, in all the things that we have on our phones, watching YouTube and TikTok and whatever all day. A person, because of love of the dunya, he gets distracted. Distraction. The dunya distracts him. And he begins to get lazy. He begins to become complacent. He begins to hate pain and suffering. In fact, this pain and suffering, it's required for human civilization to thrive. Love of the dunya and hatred for death, in essence, it inhibits human excellence. What is human excellence? Human excellence is man's desire to achieve great things. And this can be in any aspect of life. To achieve great things in religion, in politics, in military, in technology, in academics, in education. Human excellence in these aspects of life, in religion, politics, military, education, all of these things. Human excellence in these aspects of life is requirement for human civilization to flourish. to stay on top. The moment a civilization, lacks in any one of these things or a bunch of these things, especially in religion, what happens? They're dominated by other civilizations. And that's what we've seen with the Muslims. Yeah. Mainly because of their lack of religion. Yeah, that's why we were dominated. Likewise, their lack of human excellence in the worldly endeavors, like the ones I've mentioned, politics and all these things. The Muslims were divided in terms of politics. Militarily, the Muslims didn't keep up with the new technologies and whatnot of the time. Yeah. In fact, when the printing press came out, the printing press, the reason why we are able to produce books on a mass scale, Muslim scholars, they said, they don't want anything to do with this. And some scholars, they even say, not Muslim scholars, but Western scholars, they say one of the reasons, not the main reason, but one of the reasons for the downfall of the Muslims was because they said no to accepting the printing press, so that they can spread information en masse and educate the population and stuff like that. They didn't want nothing to do with that. So going back to how is it that love of the dunya leads to stopping human excellence? Again, worldly distractions. First, people become lazy, people become complacent, people become averse to pain and suffering, which are requirements for human excellence. Likewise, hatred for death, which comes hand in hand with love of the dunya. Hatred for death leads to an excessive desire for self-preservation. People begin to think that, or people stay away from risk and taking danger, even if it means for the sake of truth and standing up for the haqq and standing up for what is right and true. When people are too concerned with saving themselves and preserving themselves, they don't take risk. And oftentimes, taking risk and putting yourself in danger is required for upholding what is true, what you believe to be true and right. So, another question that comes to mind is, how do we now reverse this process? How do we now bring back the glory of Islam? We do so by doing the opposite of the thing that led to our downfall. If love of the dunya and hatred for death led to our downfall, the manifestation of which is laziness, indulgence, complacency, hatred for pain and suffering, then it makes sense that in order for us to reverse this process, we need to do the opposite of these things. We shouldn't be lazy. We need to work. Work in what sense? Work for the sake of the ummah. We need to not be indulgent. We shouldn't indulge ourselves in the many distractions. We need to show self-control, practice self-control. We can't be complacent. Just sit down and do nothing. We can't, hate suffering and pain. No, we need to accept suffering and pain. The reality is that the strength of the Muslims came from their acceptance of suffering and pain. You have Imam al-Tabari. Imam al-Tabari, he was a great mufassir of the Quran. And that wasn't all he was. He was a great scholar in many fields. He was a great scholar in the Arabic language. He was a great scholar in qira'at. He was a great scholar in hadith. Imam al-Tabari, he was known as the greatest mufassir. Practically all scholars agree that he's the greatest mufassir. He authored the greatest book of tafsir, known as Tafsir al-Tabari. So much so that the scholars even call it the Tafasir, the mother of all tafsirs. His tafsir was so great that people called it the Tafasir, the mother of all tafsirs. He even authored a book on history. Imam al-Tabari, he authored a book on history called Tarikh al-Rusul wal-Muluk. And this is a book on history from the beginning of creation up until the time of Imam Tabari himself. And in that he goes on to talk about the many prophets and kings of the time. Imam Tabari was a master of his field. Yeah. Imam Tabari, there's many things to learn from Imam Tabari. One thing you find is that, of course, being the greatest Mufassir, authoring so many books. He authored many hundreds of books, Imam Tabari authored. He was a scholar of so many different fields. Yeah, as I mentioned, hadith, fiqh. In fact, the scholars even mentioned he had his own madhab. Today we know of the 4 madhahib. The Hanafi madhab, Shafi madhab, Maliki madhab and Hanbali madhab. Imam Tabari actually, he had his own madhab at the time. Yeah, it's called the Jazari madhab. Yeah. So again, it goes to show his level of understanding in deen. He was also a great historian, as we mentioned. He wrote a book on history. You find that Imam Tabari, he didn't waste his time. He would never waste his time. His students and the scholars, they write that every day Imam Tabari would write 40 pages. 40 pages of work he would write, Imam Tabari. For 40 years, Imam Tabari did this. He would write at least 40 pages of work every day for 40 years of his life. Some of the scholars, they done the math. They found out that means he wrote more than 580,000 pages in his lifetime. Okay, Imam Tabari, his own personal notes. That doesn't mean he authored that many pages, but his own personal notes of writing, he wrote over 580,000 pages in his life. And don't forget, in those days, pages were massive. Yeah, they wrote on parchment. They didn't write on paper. They used to write on parchment. So, Imam Tabari, he wasn't lazy. He wasn't distracted by this world. We find that Imam Tabari, he was courageous. He wasn't a coward. We know this because at the time, he lived in Tabaristan. He grew up and lived in Tabaristan, which is in Iran. And he left Iran in the pursuit of knowledge. He thought, look, I've exhausted all the scholars of Tabaristan. All the scholars of this area, I've learned from. Imagine Birmingham. Yeah, you are a student of knowledge. You want to learn the deen. All the great ulama of Birmingham, you've exhausted them. You've learned everything you could from them. And you say to yourself, okay, now I need to find greater teachers, more teachers. So Imam Tabari, he moved to Iraq, Baghdad at the time. And Baghdad at the time had like 1 million people living there. Yeah, at the time, it was the biggest city. Today, a city of 1 million is not that much. It's a lot, but it's not that much. Yeah, like London has 9 million or 10 million people. Birmingham has like 2 to 3 million. So Baghdad at the time was a giant city. So Imam Tabari, he moved to Baghdad. Why? Because Imam Ahmad, we all heard of Imam Ahmad. Imam Ahmad was teaching there. Imam Tabari heard of Imam Ahmad, this great muhaddith, and he wanted to learn from him. This great muhaddith who, stood up against falsehood, who questioned and challenged the rulers and these kind of things. Imam Tabari wanted to learn from Imam Ahmad. So he moved to Baghdad. But unfortunately, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala decided otherwise. Imam Ahmad had died when he reached it. So Imam Tabari, he traveled the Muslim world at the time. He went to Syria, he went to Palestine, he went to Egypt. And he met with the greatest scholars of the time there in these different places. He traveled most of the world, Islamic world at the time. He wasn't afraid to leave his home. Today we can book a flight to our intended country. Let's say we want to go, Turkey. Before we get there, we can book a flight. Before we get there, we can book a hotel. We can arrange everything that we want to do, our food, everything, our transport, our residence, everything will be sorted. On top of that, we can, do some research. Is there a dangerous area, this and that, whatnot. In those days, you were, as they say, taking a leap of faith. You don't know what's going to happen. You might end up in Baghdad, and on the way, you might be robbed by a group of bandits. Yeah, this is impossible. Anything can happen. You might go there and you might lose your wallet, your gold coins and whatnot. You'll have no money. Traveling in those days was a great risk. On top of that, they would travel for days and days days and days and weeks and months sometimes. But again, Imam Tabari, he showed courage. He left his Tabaristan to learn from these various places. Another show of his courage is the fact that again, where he was born in Tabaristan, they had a very Shi'i leaning. The people there, they didn't like Abu Bakr radiallahu anh. They didn't like Umar radiallahu anh. They would insult Abu Bakr and Umar radiallahu anh. They would write works insulting Abu Bakr and Umar radiallahu anh. They would teach this idea of Abu Bakr and Umar, they're not important and whatnot. So Imam Tabari, this is his hometown, where there's a lot of Shias. Through his many studies and traveling, he learned that, wait a second, Imam Abu Bakr radiallahu anh, Umar radiallahu anh, these are great figures. These are Sahaba, some of the greatest Sahaba. Abu Bakr radiallahu anh is the greatest Sahaba. Umar radiallahu anh is the second greatest Sahabi. And knowing that if he speaks out against this matter, what's going to happen? The people, the king of Tabaristan is going to come after Imam Tabari to kill him or imprison him or something like this. Despite this, he wrote a book. He wrote a book in praise of Abu Bakr radiallahu anh, in praise of Umar radiallahu anh. And that's exactly what happened. The king of Tabaristan, he put out a warrant to capture Imam Tabari. So what happened? Imam Tabari had to flee. He had to flee the area. Another show of his courage is that, going back to Imam Ahmad. Imam Ahmad, he had a great following. After his death, he had a great following. And Imam Tabari, he wrote a book called Al-Ikhtilaf Al-Fuqaha, something along this line, the book was called. And the book deals with the differences of opinion of the fuqaha, of the jurists, the Islamic scholars. And he would talk about Imam Abu Hanifa, Imam Shafi and all these ones. But he didn't mention Imam Ahmad. He didn't include Imam Ahmad in this book, Ikhtilaf al-Fuqaha. So the Hanbalis, they approached Imam Tabari. They said, why didn't you include Imam Ahmad in this? Isn't he a faqih? Imam Tabari said, in my opinion, he's not a faqih. Imam Ahmad is a muhaddith. Again, like Imam Tabari, he showed great courage saying this. Why? Because at the time, the Hanbalis, they were a fanatical group. So what did they do? They decided to they got angry and they surrounded Imam Tabari's house. And they didn't let anyone in and they didn't let him out. Okay? So again, going back to what we said earlier about the strength of the Muslims came from not their laziness, their work, like Imam Tabari writing 40 pages every day for 40 years. It came from their courage. They weren't afraid to move away from the status quo. Status quo meaning everyone's doing one thing. In Tabaristan, everyone was Shi'i. But Imam Tabari found out, wait a second, Shi'ism is not the correct way. So he was courageous enough to move away from this. Okay? Imam Tabari was not indulgent. He didn't indulge the worldly pleasures and whatnot. Imam Tabari, later in his life, politicians and rulers, they would come to him and they would offer him positions of power. They would say, we want to make you a judge. They would offer him a lot of money for this. He said, no, I don't want to accept this. Why? Because I want to carry on doing what I'm doing, writing and teaching deen. And again, because of him, we have the greatest book of tafsir. Why we're able to understand the Quran the way the correct understanding of the Quran according to Nabi Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam, how Nabi Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam understood the Quran, how the Sahaba understood the Quran. We have this because of great figures like Imam Tabari. So my invitation to you today, my brothers, I'll end off with this, is, let's keep this in mind, where Muslims were in human civilization. The glory, the status of the Muslims at the time. Keep this in mind and let this be a motivation for us to work, for the sake of deen. And this doesn't mean that we all need to be scholars of deen. Okay, this doesn't mean that we all need to be scholars of deen. The great Islamic figures of history, they fell into one or two categories. I'll quickly finish off with this, inshallah. Either they were, number one, those who propagated the truth like Imam Tabari, as we mentioned. And number two, there were those who made life easy for the people. Nabi Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam says in the hadith, Yassiru wa la tu'assiru. Make things easy for the people and don't make things hard for the people. So we gave the example of Al-Jazari. Yeah, the engineer, the one who built the elephant clock. Yeah, Google this, elephant clock. The one who built automatic water raising systems. The reason why we have cars and things like this today. We have the likes of Al-Khwarizmi. Yeah, that's another Islamic scholar who he wrote a book on algebra. Yeah, his book was called Al-Jabr. In fact, the word algorithm comes from his name, Al-Khwarizmi. Yeah, algorithm. That's why we have technology today. It's all based on algorithms and whatnot. So we don't all need to be Islamic scholars. Yeah, we don't all need to work hard to be Islamic scholars. We can work hard to be doctors and inventors and engineers and whatnot. And in this way, elevate the glory of Islam as it once was. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala give us the tawfiq to, achieve great things so that we can propagate Islam and bring back the glory of Islam. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala make it easy for us. Jazakallah khair for listening. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.